About 11 months ago, my boss, Trevor Barrett, the managing director at THE, said 3 words to me that sent a shiver down my spine. It was November last year. We'd just come out of a meeting in Amsterdam. I was feeling pretty pleased with myself. We'd successfully launched that year's rankings. We'd had 2 million visits in 24 hours. I thought I'd done a rather good job. I was feeling quite smug. But Trevor was about to kick me right outside of my comfort zone with these 3 little words. Before we speculate too much about what those words were, they were, "Go for it." We were in the 11th year of the rankings. They'd become extraordinarily powerful, but since the very beginning, since 2004, the rankings had been built entirely with third-party data, outsourced completely. Trevor had decided we had to do it ourselves. His vision was that we were going to take a really bold leap from being a traditional publishing organization with a 44-year-old magazine into being a data-driven, technology-led company. We were going to rebuild the rankings from scratch. We were going to be collecting and managing and analyzing all the data under our own steam with our own team. It was a hugely daunting but incredibly exciting challenge, but it had to be done. You know, the rankings are informing academics' career decisions. They're influencing university strategies. They're even helping to shape government policy. They determine the distribution of millions of dollars in scholarships and strategic funding. And they help students and families make the most important decision of their lives, who to trust with their education. It's been said that with great power comes great responsibility. You know, I'd always assumed that quote was from some great world statesman or probably a US president. It turns out it's from the Spider-Man comics. But the principle remains the same. Times Higher Education needed to wield its power with more responsibility. We needed to be more accountable to the universities we serve. We needed to be more responsive to the rapidly changing globalized university sector and the rising number of universities seeking to develop and improve their global competitiveness. So by building the rankings ourselves, we were able to do that. So almost a year ago, Trevor said, "Go for it," and we went for it. Today, we're publishing the 2015-16 World University Rankings, and I'm extremely proud to say that after 11 months of incredibly hard work by an extraordinary team of passionate and dedicated people, we have created the biggest, most comprehensive, most inclusive rankings in our history. 800 universities ranked from 70 countries, each evaluated against 13 separate performance indicators across the full range of a university's activities: teaching, research, knowledge transfer, and international outlook. And we're publishing the results today on an entirely new web platform. More data, more functionality, more opportunities for the user to dig down beneath the data, and more opportunities for universities to showcase their individual strengths against specific data points. And the rankings are built on the richest database of research-intensive universities in the world, a huge Times Higher Education database that will grow and grow. So I'm delighted that Duncan Ross, the THE's Data and Analytics Director, will be presenting with me today to talk about the extraordinary data that underpins the World University Rankings. And with our help from friends in Elsevier, we've added indicators to the rankings that look at 51 million citations to 11.3 million research papers. So I'm also delighted that Mohammed Asati, the Director of Content and Analytics at Scopus, is also here today to talk about how Elsevier helps us fuel the rankings. But before I ask my colleagues to uncover the foundations of the rankings for you, I just want to say a few more words about where we're coming from. As I said, Times Higher Education, a 44-year-old magazine, but we're building on a century of heritage. Our sister publication, the TES, is 100 years old. And that's developed from being a magazine, an old newspaper, to being one of the leading education technology companies in the world, a network of more than 7 million teachers sharing resources, sharing material online. All we do is education. We only work with the education field, so we recognize that our data, our news, our analysis has to meet your needs, has to deliver and build on that heritage of trust within the profession. As editor of the rankings, I've been called an awful lot of things. Many of them I'm far too polite to repeat in public. I've been called the gossip girl of higher education. I've been called the Education Secretary for the World, which is one I can repeat again and again and again to the point where I hope people might start to believe it. But the one I like best, actually, which I use a lot, is I've been called the Franker Ranker. And I think it's really important that people who rank and create these rankings are transparent and accountable, and that the ranking is uncovered and unpicked so that you can get the best out of it, that you can understand what you're looking at. And in the spirit of being frank, we completely recognize that many of the things you do can't be measured. So many of your activities won't be naturally fitting into a ranking. We can work hard with you to get new data, new analyses, but a lot of that will be missed. We recognize that rankings can't capture everything, and they are a blunt instrument. So it begs the question, why do we rank at all? Well, I think it's really important to recognize international student mobility is rocketing. We have about 4 million internationally mobile students today. Predictions are that will be 8 million by 2025. Rankings are informing their decision-making. This was a survey by IDP. The ranking and reputation of a university was the single most important factor for these international students when they were making their choice. They're making a big investment. The brand, the name is so important. A recent survey by Hobson's of 45,000 students found that 1 in 3 international students use the Times Higher Education ranking. So we're informing student decision-making. But we're also providing what I think is a serious geopolitical indicator. You know, the rankings are informing policy. There's a report from the European Universities Association that they're stimulating national and international debates, driving policy change. This is a quote from Dirk van Dam, who's joining us today, about how the rankings are providing really helpful indicators to assess the success of national policy. But getting to the heart of it, I think there was a quote, or a misquote, from W. Edwards Deming, the statistician. He said, "In God we trust, all others bring data." We can't rely on reputation alone. We can't rely on heritage, on hearsay. And we can't rely on self-delusion. This idea that what matters most is how you see yourself is nonsense in a competitive global higher education world. The other reason I think we rank is there's a human instinct. I'm sure anyone here will recognize this idea. Everyone wants to see where they are. There's a natural instinct to rank. So in terms of transparency, in terms of being frank, we have 3 core sources of data underpinning the rankings. We have bibliometric data that we source from Elsevier, from Scopus, and Mohammed will be speaking about that very soon. But Times Higher Education's achievement this year is we brought in institutional data collection in-house. We've carried that out this year, and we carried out our own academic reputation survey with support from Elsevier, but as an in-house initiative. So I'm going to hand over now to Duncan Ross, the Director of Data and Analytics at THE, to talk more about the foundations of the ranking.
My name's Duncan, and I'm a data scientist, which has meant that I had a sartorial decision to make this morning. Should I go for a T-shirt with an appropriate slogan, or should I go for a shirt and tie? I'm glad to see that the data looking around this room suggests I was correct to go for the shirt and tie. But my interest in the rankings is firmly around how we can make the data that we gather as useful and as accurate as possible. So I thought I would focus a little bit on what has changed, because as Phil will tell you later on, our underlying methodology, the approach we take to what things are important and how we balance those, is fundamentally the same this year as it has been since 2010. But there have been significant changes, largely to the underlying data. The first thing that is significantly different is that we have significantly expanded the number of institutions that we've involved in the ranking process. This is really crucial. Education is international. It's not sufficient just to look at the usual suspects at the top. We actually have to recognize that many countries are now playing in the higher education market space, and that this is a worldwide concern. But for those of you who then think, well, 800 is a huge number to be ranked, let's remember that there are over 18,000 universities in the world. We are still looking only at the top 4% of universities internationally. Every single institution that we have talked to, never mind listed, is a great university. We've actually reached out to 1,126 participants. So 1,126 universities have submitted data this year. And of those, we've actually ranked, I've got to correct you slightly, Phil, but I am a nerd and I do focus on details. We've actually ranked 801 institutions because there was a tie. Two institutions scored the same value, and that actually increased us to 801. But this also has a mathematical impact because when we calculate our scores, in order to blend data from different types of measurement, we normalize the data. And in previous years, we were normalizing over 400, and this year we're normalizing over 801. So that's a mathematical change. The second thing that has changed is our reputation survey. As Phil has said, we have brought that in-house. We're supported very ably by Elsevier in identifying appropriate individuals who might want to receive this. But one of the huge changes this year is that we've looked to balance this better geographically. When we looked at how the reputation survey had been balanced in previous years, we found that far too many respondents came from the US and the UK. And if we really want to reflect international opinion, that simply isn't acceptable. So we used data from the OECD that looks at where research takes place, and we actively balanced our survey across the geographies of the world. And that too has had a difference, made a difference. The third change, obviously, is the change to using Elsevier's Scopus database. I'm going to leave discussion of the strengths of Elsevier's database to Mohammed in a few minutes. But let me say this was a very positive move from our perspective. Not only is the data itself richer, stronger, as we'll hear, but also it has been very helpful working with the team from Elsevier who have been able to support us and give us insights along the way. But as a result of these three changes, although the methodology has stayed the same, the data has changed. And as a result, we strongly recommend that people don't do direct comparisons with previous years. Although it may be tempting if you've gone up to say, actually, you know, look how we've improved, the measurement you're seeing here is different. The numbers can't be directly compared. A little bit more about the balance of the survey. So these are the numbers from the survey that was actually used in the reputation ranking that was announced earlier in the year. But as you can see, this year, for the first time, we have a much more representative input to the reputation survey from Asia than we've ever had before. This really does reflect a change in the balance of the world in higher education. That although, as we can see from the rankings themselves, the US still dominates, it certainly isn't the global hegemony that it used to be. We've also put the proportions of academics who've responded from different academic areas into the broad 6 categories that we use within Times Higher Education. We don't currently balance for those, but it's pleasing to see that there is a reasonable distribution across that. So where are we going with data? Because however important I may think data science is, it's less important than the minister, so I have less time now than I previously had. So with the future of data, there are 2 key aspects to this that go beyond the simple rankings. The first one is that we are convinced that our data sets should become a resource for universities to understand and to inform decision-making processes. So we have just launched a series of data products. I'm not going to go into them now, but I will be showcasing those during the breaks if anyone's interested in looking at those further. But our hope there is that this will help you to understand how you compare to other institutions, where you are relatively strong, where you have areas where you can improve, where the opportunities lie. The second, of course, is as a resource for students. Increasingly, students need to understand how to compare institutions that are not in their home country. If you go to a person on the street in whichever country you live in and ask them which are the strongest universities, which are the weakest universities, they will usually have an idea. But if you ask them the same for another country, it's much more challenging. And so providing a rich resource for students and prospective students, we hope we can provide opportunities and insights that wouldn't previously have been available. My final slide then, because I'm trying to keep things brief. On the future of rankings, where do we go from here? Well, we acknowledge that there have been some significant changes this year, not in the methodology, but in the data. As a result, we will try and keep the World University Rankings themselves stable for the next few years. We will not make any major changes in methodology or in data. We are, of course, very interested in hearing from you about ways we can improve, other factors we can add into the rankings. And we will experiment with those, but we will tend to experiment with those alongside the main ranking. So we may produce, for example, additional information on community involvement or community outreach. Or we might provide additional information on teaching outcomes and value added. But these would sit firmly alongside rather than be incorporated within the main rankings for the next few years. We hope this will give you the stability needed to understand trends and changes. We'll also look at ways we can expand and deepen the information we can provide around subject areas. This is a challenge in our data gathering approach. Where we go to universities and say we would like to gather 50, 60, 100 data points, that's fine. If we now go and say, well, actually we need 100 data points for all of the 300 subjects you teach, then it becomes an unacceptable burden on institutions. But this is one place where we hope that you as universities can apply pressure on your governments to actually assist in this whole process. We're lucky in the UK that we have an active open data movement and that universities supply data to the Higher Education Statistics Authority that then allows some of that data to be used by external organisations. It's a really positive thing, not just for organisations like ourselves, but for universities who can then compare themselves to their peers directly, and also to the wider economy who have the ability to understand what can be offered by the higher education sector and to involve themselves more deeply. So with that, I'd like to take the opportunity to hand over to Mohammed from Elsevier, who's going to take you through some of the strengths and amazing strengths that Scopus can provide.
Thank you, Duncan. Good morning, all. It's a really great pleasure to be here. We've done this a couple of times in other regions, but this is the World University Ranking, so it's a global event, and it's a really pleasure to represent here Elsevier and to talk a little bit about our contribution to the work that Duncan and Phil and our colleagues in THE have been doing. So my name is Mohammed Aysati. I work for Elsevier, and I'm based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. In the next trial, so to keep it as short as possible, 8 minutes, 8 to 10 max, I'll try to talk to you a little bit about Scopus, our contribution for the bibliometric part of the rankings, and show you a little bit what we've done, particularly for this time around for the rankings. So let me talk to you a little bit about Scopus. And I think most of you probably have seen one another and hope and assume that some have access already to Scopus.com, our web tool. But the database itself, which was launched back in 2004, includes a very rich global coverage, certainly compared to competition. As we speak today, we have actually more than 23,000 titles. Many of the numbers that you'll be seeing here are slightly out of date because they've been produced earlier this year. So for example, if you talk in terms of number of papers, we have already passed the 58.5 million. We have more than 50 books as we speak right now, adding more and more books to address particular subject areas for which we know that researchers don't necessarily publish in serial titles, I should say. What we also have, and I think it's a very important piece of information that we keep repeating to people, Scopus is an Elsevier product. However, it covers journals from more than 5,000 publishers, from more than 100 countries, and actually more than 50 languages. So the focus is not only on English, but also to give a podium and a platform for local journals, for journals with local languages, I should say better, that has the potential to go global, and therefore trying to give a platform for these journals to be exposed to the external world. So if you look at the number of journals that we have today in Scopus that do cover non-English papers, it's about 19%. Now, this is an important piece, particularly in the context of ranking, because typically people from Spain, maybe from Germany, from non-English nations might have the idea that research is not necessarily covered sufficiently to be part of the ranking. So as part of the Scopus initiative, we try to add as many journals and books as possible that do matter to the science and technical and medicine area, and including also the social sciences, I should add. Let's zoom a little bit in more details about the coverage itself. Within Scopus, we try to actually create the distribution of this data in 4 major subject areas. And as you can see, that the distribution is fairly balanced. We have almost more or less the same number of journals per subject area, including journals and books particularly, where I would like to say a couple of words there, because one of the points that we took as feedback from the community itself is the coverage of specifically social sciences, where we know that researchers do not publish in journals, as I mentioned earlier. So we have been adding a lot of books to address that particular point, and we started this project in 2013, where we added since 50,000, and we aim to finish the project by the end of this year, reaching 75,000 books. I'm talking books, not necessarily in book chapters, because if you could convert that to the items, to the chapters itself, I think we have already passed the 500,000 of that. One of the things that I would like to highlight is the patent coverage within Scopus. I think we heard from the minister, and I think I was very pleased to hear the patent citations. So Scopus covers patents as well, and I think the beauty of the particular coverage of patents is the linkage to the journal publication. The linkage is established by looking at the number of times publications have been cited by patents. This could be a very useful proxy indicator to measure things around innovation, about research commercialization, recognizing that patents are typically filed by industry rather than by academic institution. So the inevitable question is always, okay, how do you compare to the competition, right? Specifically, knowing that the last iteration of the World University Ranking has been conducted using Web of Science as a data source. Now, it's very simple. When we started Scopus in 2004, we had around 16,000 titles, and we have grown since to pass the 23,000. And across the subject areas, you will see the surplus that is almost doubling, certainly in areas like physical sciences and other areas. So we add many more journals, as I mentioned, to give a platform to specific geographies to also be represented in a global database such as Scopus. Now, when we always say this, people also wonder, what about the quality of these journals? Are we not diluting maybe the database itself? Well, it should be noted that we at Elsevier do not have a saying or a decision-making regarding the journals that are added into Scopus or not. There is an independent board that has been put together comprising very prominent research leaders who actually have the full empowerment to decide whether a journal gets into Scopus or not. To give you a couple of numbers, in the last 5 years, we have received about 5,000 title suggestions, of which we had to reject almost 60%. So that is one way to sustain the quality of the research that we have, while giving, as I mentioned, particular researchers that publish in local languages also a podium to expose their research. There are criteria that we do require. So one of them, for example, is that the abstract of the article has to be in English, and that the publishing itself has to follow ethical practices, and that there is a recurring publishing processes behind the journal itself. So let me talk quickly about the snapshot that we created particularly for the World University Ranking exercise itself. So the number, and I'm not going to read all the numbers, I think Phil already mentioned that it's more than 11 million articles covering only document types that we have as articles, conference papers, and reviews. In other words, we do not take into account things like letters, like short surveys, like books necessarily themselves. So this is a common practice where we look at these 3 document types that are most visible to the citations. And we have included them, and you can see the distribution that most of it is articles and reviews, of course, and the conference proceedings, just because they are not serial events necessarily, you see that the number is lower. One of the things that is also noted as part of the changes is obviously that we are taking a much current reference period. So you can see that the most recent year is actually last year, so the information that you get is quite current compared to the previous iterations, where there is always a lag of 2 years. So for example, in the World University Ranking 2014, the reference period that was used at the time was 2008 to 2012. So we try to be much more current, and thanks to our big data platform, we can actually crunch that data very fast and provide it to our colleagues at THE. My last slide, in the case you like numbers, because we have been speaking about numbers, and this is not to be a nerd, because we have numbers all the way till the decimals, but just a couple of things to highlight there. As we mentioned, 11 million articles, more than 50 million citations, produced by around 8 million authors. We can count actually the authors in Scopus because we can disambiguate individuals to not talk about a piece of string of text, but really about the researcher themselves. Covering 51 different languages, again, ranging all the way from German, Spanish, or to some very minor languages there. We have focused about on 6,000 institutions that we have curated, mostly also by hand, which are visible in our analytical platform called SciVal. These institutions coming from 247, so in case you didn't know there were 247 countries, I was a little bit surprised to see that number. I thought it was much lower, but you can also get things like the Vatican City, etc. So I was looking at the most cited paper in that period, and it appeared to be a paper in molecular biology, authored by Penn State, Arizona State, and Tokyo Metropolitan University. So interesting also to try to look at these universities where they did end up in the ranking, although this is, again, just one single paper. Harvard, obviously, the most producing papers, so not entirely surprising, and the US being the country with the largest number of papers in that set. So if you take all these numbers, like the number of institutions, the number of subject areas, 6 plus 1, which is covering all subject areas together combined, and the number of years, the number of metrics we produced. So it's almost nearing 900,000 data points that needed to be aggregated to produce our contribution for the bibliometric side, which are 3 metrics: the citation score, the international collaboration, which makes part of the international outlook in the THE indicators, and the number of publications, which is then normalized by the number of staff. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening and hand over back to Phil.
So that was the science bit. I think it's really important that we are building these rankings on very, very solid foundations. It's absolutely essential to Times Higher Education that we are giving you meaningful data built on real professionalism. So I'm really grateful for those 2 contributions. We're going to get onto the results. But I just want to be clear, the methodology itself, we've kept it the same, 13 separate indicators spread out across 5 core areas: teaching, research, research impact, international outlook, and industry income. At the break, we'll be giving you out the official rankings publication with all this information in it and detailed descriptions. But it's important for us that it's a balanced and comprehensive methodology. And we're looking at things that many other rankings don't look at, particularly the teaching environment, faculty-student ratios, the amount of resource a university has, the research intensity. We look at industry income, the only ranking that looks at a university's interaction with the private sector. and international outlook, I think, a really important aspect of any world-class research university is it truly global? Is it collaborating globally? Is it drawing in faculty from all over the world? Is it pulling in international students? So that's our formula. We'll continue to discuss that. I'm sure there's been lots of challenges and discussions around the methodology over the course of the breaks. But let's get on to the results. The World Top 10 for 2015-16. You may have seen it in the newspapers this morning, but I'm delighted to confirm Caltech, the California Institute of Technology, is #1 for the 5th year in a row. Chicago's returned to the top 10 this year. A big story for me is ETH Zurich from Switzerland has broken into the world top 10. That's the first university outside the US and UK that's made it into the top 10 for a decade. And I'm absolutely delighted ETH are here, and Sarah will be speaking later during this conference about the incredible success story there. Asia Pacific, an area very close to our hearts here in Melbourne. It's very gratifying for Melbourne, I'm sure, to be confirmed as the #2 university in the Asia Pacific region, #1 in Australia by our metrics. But I think we can see here an exciting opportunity for Australia, working amongst some of the most dynamic and upwardly mobile higher education sectors in the world. The story, I think, this year is NUS Singapore is Asia's new #1. It had been Tokyo, and I think we have a clear pattern here with Japanese universities struggling with an inward-facing approach, struggling with international outlook. NUS Singapore at the heart of a country, a city-state that actually has people as its sole resource, putting in its investment, betting its economic future on innovation, on skills, on great universities. Go across the rest of the world. Oxford is the UK and Europe's #1. Singapore, as I say, NUS. Melbourne, Australasia's #1. Cape Town in South Africa is Africa's #1 in 120th. Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the Middle East region at 178. South America's top representative is Sao Paulo in the 251-300 band. Looking across the top 200, we can really start to see that although the US's influence is waning, the US still utterly dominates. It has 63 of the world's top 200 universities. That's down from in the 70s last year, so we are seeing a rebalancing of the power. The hegemony of America is being challenged. I think some of the state universities suffering from funding constraints, real difficult political circumstances are seeing some downward movement. Places like Germany rising up the rankings strongly through the Excellence Initiative, through differential funding. The UK doing exceptionally well, I think, through a focused approach around the research excellence framework, a national obsession with pushing forward the research agenda in terms of drawing in talent, focusing on quality outputs and strategic quality. Across the world, we see a really diverse group of universities make the top 200. It's a very healthy, mixed economy. I'm delighted to see how many countries make the top 200. And as I say, across the 800, there are 70 countries represented. It's really exciting that so many nations are prioritizing world-class research universities. They're investing in them, and we're seeing them making the mark. And that's one of the most exciting things for me about rankings. It's not just about reaffirming the old hierarchies. It's not just about coming out every year and talking about the Harvards and Stanfords of this world. We're seeing developing countries' investments paying off. We're seeing some exciting performers. What does the average world top 200 look like? I mean, obviously, there is no average performer. They all are exceptional institutions with different histories, different governance structures, different funding environments. But I think there's a few telling points here if you look at the average data points around the top 200. First of all, a very healthy faculty-student ratio, 16.5 to 1, student-faculty ratio. Most of you are old, 1803, average foundation date, giving some sense that actually history, heritage is an important part of the journey. But actually we have the young universities doing really well, developing at the forefront of innovation. Resources, you have to have tremendous resource, almost $1 million per staff member as a university's total income. These are rich universities, a message for all governments. If you want sustainable excellence in higher education, you have to pay for it. You have to invest, and the investment will come back and be returned in fourfold in terms of skilled workforce, innovation, technological advancement. But the key thing for me, really, really important, is these universities are international. 22% of their faculty are international faculty. 21% of their students are international students. These are low-weighted areas in rankings, but I think they're the secret of success right across the rankings indicators. People, talent, embracing globalization. There's a wonderful quote from Alice Gass at Imperial College London, who wrote for the ranking supplement last year. She talked about this concept of hybrid vigor. That actually research teams thrive and are more innovative, more exciting when you bring people with different backgrounds, different cultures, different learning experiences together. That's where the creative tension comes into play, and you can really start pushing boundaries. Looking at what's going on in individual universities, we have our new website launched today. We have lots of great data on there, very interactive, individual breakdowns of each institution's scores. And I think the thing that's important for me here in terms of the dynamics in Asia, the move of NUS to #1 and Tokyo's dropped down. You can see the scores are very, very similar, but it's in the area of international outlook where Tokyo is far, far behind. Again, it's embracing the global talent pool, being networked, working in a truly global environment. If you think about the opportunities in NUS, the NUS Yale initiative, the NTU Imperial College initiative, they're really important. Peking, I think, the sense of it being a sleeping giant, it's made its way more comfortably into the world top 50. The investment is paying off. The next step, I think, for a lot of Asian universities to truly push on is in this area of international outlook. It's the one weak area of Peking, and it's something that universities in China and elsewhere in the region are dealing with and addressing, and I think we are going to continue to see Asian universities pushing up these rankings over time. There's a comment from Alan Goodman in a book which kind of answered its own question, Asia, the next higher education superpower. I think the answer to that question is yes, as long as they get things right around freedom, around institutional autonomy, but the money is there. But here, Alan's saying, governments in Asia see internationalization of their colleges and universities as a means to capitalize on rapid globalization and remain competitive in the global marketplace. Their progress in these regards will define Asia's future involvement with the world and possibly redefine the way the world engages in higher education. It's a really important theme of this conference that we are global institutions. We are drawing on a global talent pool, and I think we are going to see some real dynamic change in the rankings in the future based on this drive. Looking at individual stars, it's quite interesting to look at the strategies of universities who've been doing particularly well in rankings. Exeter University has been rising up. I spoke to their president, Steve Smith, before I came here, and of course he focused on the fact that they've had a very, very concentrated research strategy. They've been very ruthless in getting out of areas that aren't working for them as an institution, of concentrating their resources. But again, they've pushed into interdisciplinary research, but a major theme has been international research cooperation. Steve said that they were the early people to recognize Jonathan Adams' research on the fourth age of research, which is all about the internationalization of the research base. Similarly, Maastricht University, another rising star, making really strong strides in rankings. It does exceptionally well on industry income, which is a very low-weighted area, but it's about its focus on applied research. It's a small, young university. It has a clear focus on research that is real-world relevant. That's not appropriate for everyone, but it's a part of its key strategy. But again, in the Netherlands, in a very advantageous part of the world in terms of geography, it's an absolutely international organization, and it's been in the press in the UK for many years as a place that's delighted to challenge British universities to recruit British domestic students, offering far, far cheaper tuition fees. Nanyang Technological University, yet again, clearly applied research, a narrow focus on research from its engineering school basis, but international outlook, again, a common characteristic of these rising stars, these global ranking high performers. And I want to leave time for Q&A. It's really important, this notion of us being the franker rankers. We want to leave question time. So I'm going to wrap up, but there's so much more online. We have 800 universities ranked. That is the distribution of them around the world. We're delighted to have created such a more inclusive picture. You can see the dominance of North America and Western Europe, but there are some really healthy pockets of excellence, some new power axes emerging. I love the fact that Southeast Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong becoming extraordinarily exciting areas. And Australia is in a fantastic position to capitalize on that. Really, really exciting opportunity there. I'd like you to stay with us on our journey, the schedule of this event next year. Keep these conversations going, keep these interactions going, make sure we continue the dialogue. We're running around the world this year. I'm delighted to confirm, and we'll hear from Nick Dirks later, we'll be holding the next year's World Academic Summit at UC Berkeley this time next year. But keep engaging. We need to hear from you. We need to discuss the methodology with you. We want your constructive criticism. You want your feedback. And on that basis, we do have some time for some Q&A. So I'm going to sit down and join the rest of the panel. And I'd like to see some hands for some questions or some challenges. Thanks very much indeed. We do have a hand here from an intimidating member of the audience, Brian Schmidt.
One of the big changes has been that we're having more and more science done in larger and larger groups. So the methodological challenge of how you deal with large groups, high energy physics being the worst, but astronomy, my own field, being problematic. What are you doing? Are you dividing by the number of authors? Because if you don't conserve, you can game the system.
So I think this is one for us and Elsevier. This is a real challenge, particularly in the area of high energy physics. It's not just that there are many thousands of authors, it's that it is a conscious decision on the part of the high energy physics community to list authors in a way that can't be broken down to understand who has contributed and when. And it's for perfectly legitimate reasons. You have huge experiments that take many, many years, and at the end of the day, can you honestly say that the 7 people who do the analysis deserve all of the credit? But from a pure data perspective, this has caused some significant misbalancing for a small number of institutions. There were 649 papers in this year's broader data set with more than 1,000 authors. For most institutions that had a broad base of research, it made very little difference, but there were a smaller group where actually this may have represented up to 17% of all of their research. The short-term solution we took was simply not to count those papers. Okay. It wasn't an ideal approach, but it was at least straightforward and understandable. In the longer term, I'm looking for a way that we can reincorporate them in a way that is fair both to high energy physics, but more importantly to the rest of the academic world, including the rest of physics. Because at the end of the day, the average number of authors for a physics paper is 4.8. It's not 1,000, it's not 3,200. And theoretical physics was suffering as a result of this. So I don't have a good solution at the moment. I have an adequate solution for this year. But any insight or thought that could be given around this would be warmly welcome. Simple fractional counting is as good as throwing them out, to be honest. If you go from any paper with 3,500 contributors, well, you get 3,500 of a contribution for it. I might as well not include it. Also, fractional counting has another bizarre effect, which means that if I'm going for my 1,000th author and I'm considering including another author, it has almost no difference on the impact. Whereas if I go from 3 authors to 4 authors, it has a vast impact on the way that it's counted. So I'd very much appreciate any input you can have. And sorry if I talked for too long on that, Phil.
Thank you very much. I think that is one of the most challenging questions we have. This big science is absolutely exciting. It's important. It's set the world alight in terms of demonstrating the incredible power of research, but causing a huge headache for academics. But I want to get to some more questions. There's one here. Thanks.
Thank you. Matthew Omar, Victoria, University of Wellington. The question is about the surveys, the languages that you use for the surveys. I believe there were some new ones this year. Please correct me if that's wrong. Which were the languages you used to survey academics? Why did you choose those languages? And if there were changes, what do you think their impact was?
So there were 15 languages used in the surveys. I can't name all of them off the top of my head, but certainly traditional Chinese, Japanese, Korean were amongst those. In terms of the change in distribution, so that has clearly had an impact, and not always in the way expected. But in defense of that, it was something I felt we had to do. Having a survey that was so heavily biased towards the US and the UK, I have no reason to believe that academics in the US and the UK are particularly better informed or less biased than academics elsewhere in the world. In terms of the mechanism, we were supported strongly by Elsevier on this in terms of identifying who the potential recipients were. And then from within that group, we randomly sampled across the countries in the world. And then where we had a lower response rate than we anticipated, we went back and actually surveyed those areas to build those numbers up.
Yeah, just a small addition there. So we came up with, let's say, an algorithm actually to determine the recipient of this of the survey. So we used, for example, to focus on the most active researchers in the last couple of years as opposed to go for a larger period of time. We tried to balance across subject areas as well so that we have also responses from social sciences and physics, etc., so that we also balanced. We actually produced a much larger number that we eventually used just because we wanted indeed for where we had less responses to do another wave. So we tried to keep the wave still. We have a balanced view. I think eventually we reached the 10,500 responses, and at certain points we just basically shut down the period of time. We could have, we could continue if we had more time to do that.
We do have time for one or two more. While you're thinking, I'd like to ask one myself. Oh, sorry, we do have one here. I won't, Dominic.
Sarah Springman here. I'd be absolutely delighted to hear from you. What was the greatest surprise to emerge from the rankings process and the end results? Just a quick one from each of you, please.
I think for me, Harvard's lowest position in the history of our rankings. I think there's a case there which it's got nothing to do with Harvard getting any worse. As I was saying last night, it's a case of the tide is rising all boats, but I think it demonstrates that some of the greatest household names, they have to run fast to stand still. Other people's data were improving more quickly, so it wasn't a case of them getting any worse. Their income was rising, their citation impact was improving, but actually other institutions, particularly Stanford, were actually improving more quickly and increasing their income more quickly, for example. So for me, it's probably that one. Your appearance in the top 10 was a genuine one as well. The fact that the US-UK dominance had been broken, but we'd kind of known that was happening. You'd been surging up over the years, and it wasn't too surprising, but it was a nice symbolic moment, I think.
So I think my most interesting insight, bearing in mind I'm someone who's been out of the higher education world for the better part of a large number of years that I won't name, the biggest surprise I found was actually when I did some deeper analysis. And I did some clustering, and my team did some clustering of universities that didn't take into account the rankings. So we clustered on some of the additional reputation data that we'd had before and some of the citation data around the 6 subject areas. But then seeing that when you overlaid data from the rankings, that actually there were some clear interlinkings there. So obviously we saw the group of the oldest universities that you might expect at the top, but we also saw distinct groups around institutions who are challenging that group from Southeast Asia. We saw other groups around the BRICS and emerging economies come together. So the fact that these other views also feed into that, I think, was the biggest insight from my perspective.
Well, in my case, it's for me very difficult to point out a university in particular. But I think what we at Elsevier found very nice to work with the guys here is just to actually increase the number of institutions themselves to be ranked. I mean, to be honest with you, on a personal side, I couldn't understand why we always ended up at 400, recognizing that the world is much larger than that. So I was very pleased to see that we are going to 800. Even if you're ranked, 700, whatever, or 799, you're still making it to the top, top 4% of the entire world. So that's really a big improvement. And as far as I'm concerned, I would like to see the time that we reach the 1,000 or even more, because, and as part of what we always get as feedback from some universities, some are just seeking for visibility, to start with, not even to be ranked. So I think giving more chances to go globally and increase the number of institutions was probably the highlight for me.
Okay, well, we're coming quite close to the break. I'll take one final question, the gentleman at the back there. While we're waiting for the mic, I'd quite like to just quickly ask you very briefly, what do you think the future holds in terms of where metrics go next? Duncan, teaching, innovation?
I would love to see something around teaching, but it's a very challenging area because it's hard enough within a single country to find equivalency in terms of output versus input, never mind when you go internationally. But it's clearly an area of focus. We're looking at some work that looks at the pressage process and product of teaching programs and trying to understand how we can match metrics to those different elements to give a balanced understanding. And that would be my single biggest goal.
Mohammed, very briefly, and then we'll have the final.
For us, I think one of the things that really keeps us awake, I would say, is actually try to figure out a way to measure quantitatively the societal and the economical impact of research. If we can crack that piece, and at Elsevier we have been trying to do a lot of work to come up with proxies in the lack of something better. But that would be our challenge coming up, and it would be great if we can find out a way to actually include that also in the rankings.
Thank you. I know this is the final question for the session, but obviously there'll be many more questions at all the breaks and through lunch and the social. So let's have the last question, please.
Okay, I'm Liu Yaolin from Wuhan University of China. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. You see, there are a lot of factors influence the final ranking result. So I would like to ask how to decide the weight to these factors, but this will influence the final result. Thank you very much.
I think that the weightings really were determined back in 2010. The point is there is no exact science governing this. It is a subjective view from us about which elements we think deserve what weight. The concept really at the beginning was about which metrics do the university community value, which metrics do they genuinely trust as serious proxies, as serious indicators, and which aspects of the university's performance do they think needs to be recognized and measured. So actually we had about an 11-month process of consultation. We had a survey of user needs. How do you use rankings? What do you want from rankings? What's missing? What are your concerns? We reflected on that. We created a draft methodology. We put it out for consultation and criticism. So there'll be areas we wanted to look at around income, research income, but people feed back and say, well, actually, in some countries it's highly competitively distributed. In other countries it's not. It shouldn't be overweighted because it doesn't reflect these differences. Clearly, there's a high consensus that citation analysis is a well-established and trusted way of judging research quality. So there's no exact science, but I think THE took what I think was a very, very consultative and inclusive approach. One of the things we'd like to experiment with, I think, is, of course, sticking with those weightings, but with the fact that we own the data, the fact that we have much more data at our own disposal, we can allow users to manipulate that data and over time potentially play with it and create their own analyses against their own criteria.
And I think the other thing to say is that particularly when we look to the regional rankings, we have the flexibility to think about adjusting those to reflect the specific higher education needs and relevancies within that region. And specifically this year, I suspect the first one we will do that with on a large scale will be the Asian rankings. So we published these in June. We don't want to do a simple cut-down list of the existing ranking. I don't think that adds a lot more value. But we do have the opportunity to look at how we balance the different elements across that. In terms of the main university rankings, of course, the challenge is, do we iterate each year as insight comes from yourselves, which has the advantage of keeping it dynamic in terms of, and flexible in terms of the changing marketplace, but has the disadvantage of preventing year-on-year comparison or making year-on-year comparison more difficult. And that's why I'm taking this twin-track approach, particularly when it comes to new measures, that we maintain the World University Ranking for a period of time, continue consulting about how that could be changed, but alongside it bringing in new measures that can be used to provide additional insight whilst not in the short term feeding directly into the rankings themselves.
Okay, well, we've hit time for a break, so I just want to thank you for your engagement and thank Mohammed and Duncan for their contributions, and we'll enjoy some coffee.